All right, guys. Tonight's notes are entitled Writing Our Constitution. We've been looking at in class the Articles of Confederation, the first government of the United States, and looking at the issues, the weaknesses, the problems associated with the Articles of Confederation. And after we've got issues with foreign powers, we've got issues with disputes between states, we have Shays' Rebellion. Some of the leaders of the United States call for a convention that will come together and deal with the problems of the Articles of Confederation. Their original plan was to just amend it, make changes to improve it. But by the end, they're going to end up creating a whole new constitution, a whole new government. And we're going to look at some of the decisions that they had to make to create this new government with our notes tonight. And we're going to break it up into two parts. Part one is entitled Creating Congress. So the Constitutional Convention met and had 55 delegates. And those delegates came from 12 different states. The only state that didn't send any delegates was Rhode Island. Rhode Island was really concerned about and making changes to the Articles of Confederation. They were worried about they were going to be losing some of their freedoms, some of their sovereignty, some of their rights. So they did not send any delegates. All of the delegates who went to the Constitutional Convention were white men, and most of them are well off. They own property. These are rich white guys. All right. Here's some of the ideas that are going to be influencing them. These are things that they're going to be keeping in mind when they're designing a government. First of all, the idea of separation of powers, that the power of the government should not be held by one person or one group of people. Instead, those powers should be split up. And this is where we end up seeing three branches of government. We have the legislative, executive, and judicial. And as we've been talking about in class a little bit, the legislative branch, their responsibility is to create laws. The executive branch is to enforce those laws. And the judicial branch, their job is to interpret those laws. So each branch has their own responsibility, has their own power as it relates to the government. Related to separation of powers is the idea of checks and balances. That each branch has the ability to check the power of others to make sure that no branch becomes too powerful. So by checking the power of others, it keeps things in balance. Checks and balances. Okay? So there's several big issues that they need to figure out when they're writing the Constitution as it relates to creating Congress. The first is how should seats in Congress be given out? If you remember under the Articles of Confederation, the idea was each state had one seat. Each state had one vote. All right. Now, some states like Virginia did not like that. So the delegates for Virginia proposed for the new government, they proposed the Virginia Plan, all right, in which there would be two houses in Congress. And each house would have representatives, all right, based off of the population of that state. So states with more people would get more votes than states with fewer people. So a big state with Virginia would get more representatives, so more votes in these two houses compared to smaller states like Connecticut. On the other side of this debate were the smaller states, and they put forth the New Jersey Plan. The New Jersey Plan was the idea that it's pretty much keeping what they had under the Articles of Confederation. There is one house of Congress, and in that house, each state has the same number of seats. Each state is independent. Each state is sovereign. Each state should be equally represented. No one state is greater than any others. And this issue is hugely divisive in the Constitutional Convention. It almost ends the Constitutional Convention before any significant progress is made. However, a solution is eventually found, and it is known as the Great Compromise. Great, significant, right? So the Great Compromise says it brings these two plans together. There's going to be two houses of Congress, just like they had in the Virginia Plan. One of the houses is the House of Representatives, and it would give out seats, give out representation based on population. So the bigger you are, the more people you have in your state, the more seats you have in the House of Representatives. The other house, in this case the Senate, would have equal representation from every state. And so each state would send 2 senators to represent them in the Senate. So House of Representatives, we have seats based on population. In the Senate, we have seats. Every state has the same amount. So it compromises the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan together, creating the Great Compromise. And that's how Congress works today. All right? But this doesn't solve all of the issues related to how do we determine seats in Congress. The other issue that needs to be resolved has to do with slavery. Should slaves be counted towards the population of a state? When you think about this, all right, if you're a state like South Carolina, you have a lot of slaves. If slaves are counted towards your population, you're going to get more seats in Congress, in the House of Representatives, than other states that don't have slaves. All right? So states that had a lot of slaves would get more seats because they had slaves. Whereas states that didn't have slaves, all right, it's just it's the population of free people. And they didn't like that because slaves aren't free, so why should they be counted towards the population of a state? Their voices are not heard. They are disenfranchised, don't have the right to vote. They should not be counted towards the population. Now, this leads to another compromise. We've got the Great Compromise to solve the issue of appointing seats. This solution is a little bit less enthusiastic. This is kind of an infamous compromise. It's called the 3/5 compromise. And the way it worked, to figure out how many seats should be apportioned to each state based on its population, when you think about slavery, what they did was they decided that every slave counted as 3/5 of a person. They weren't a whole person. They were most of a person. So if a state had 5,000 slaves, say, that's a small number, okay? But say they had 5,000 slaves. When you're totaling up that state's population, you would count that they had 3,000 people out of those 5,000 slaves. Now, when we think about this from a modern perspective, we think, 1, that doesn't make sense. 2, that's absolutely horrible. All right. But for them, this was a compromise to a significant problem that they were having. So when they used this little math, this 3/5 for every slave, the total would be added to the state's population. And that was the number that was used to count for representation in the House of Representatives, as well as for determining a state's population in terms of taxation. Okay? So that wraps up creating Congress. That's part 1 of our notes. So we've got a response question that I want you to answer. So feel free to pause and think about this before you move on to part 2. Part 1's response question is, why do you think it is important to split power up into 3 branches of government? All right, separation of powers. Why is it important? And then give an example of something bad that might happen if we didn't split up power this way, if we didn't have a separation of powers, if all the power in government was placed in one group of people, one body, or even potentially one person. What's something that bad that might happen as a result of not having a separation of powers? All right, feel free to pause this and answer that question. I am going to go and move on to part 2 of writing our Constitution, creating the presidency. All right, when we talked about the Articles of Confederation, we know that there was only a legislative branch. There was no executive, okay? Because many people were worried that if there was some sort of president or executive, he would become, or she, theoretically, although unlikely, would become too powerful that they would act like a king. All right, they had just fought a war to overthrow a king, and they didn't want to set up a government where they have indirectly created a new king. All right, so the framers of the Constitution, writers of the Constitution, all right, wanted to create an executive branch, somebody with the authority to enforce the laws. All right, but they had to consider how best to do this. So they had several questions that they considered before assigning powers and authority to this chief executive, to the president. All right. First of all, how long should the president serve? Should the president serve a relatively short term, like 2 years, a longer term, like 6, 7, 8 years, or could the president serve for life? Second question: if they're serving a term, should they be able to be reelected when that term was up? Another question: should there be one president, one person who's the chief executive, or should it be a group, a committee that serves as the chief executive of the executive branch? When considering these questions, they came up with our current presidents, all right, our current presidential system, where there is one president who serves a term of 4 years. And at the end of that 4-year term, they are able to run for and be re-elected to serve as president again for another 4-year term. Now, they still had to consider how would they choose who would become the president. All right. Some argued that there should be a direct election where the American people should vote directly on who should be president. Whoever gets the most votes becomes president. Others were concerned. They wanted Congress, the legislative branch, to pick the president because, when you're thinking this is the late 1700s, they didn't think people would be able to know enough about those running, about the candidates, to make an informed decision, right? If somebody's running and they live in New York and you're a farmer in Georgia, how are you supposed to know anything about that candidate, right? There's no internet, there's no Twitter, there's no 24-hour news cycles. So there's very, very little information that you can get to learn about that candidate. They didn't trust people to make that informed decision. So they came up with a solution, and that solution was the Electoral College. The way the Electoral College works is the people do choose the president, but they do so through an indirect method called the Electoral College, okay? The people will vote for electors, and each state gets a certain number of electors based on their population. And those electors would have the final say in who would be president. So that's why on presidential election nights, you see maps that look like this, where each state has a certain number of electors in the Electoral College. And the way that state votes determines how those electors cast their votes for the president. So it's not a total number of votes, it's the total number of votes in each state count for or go towards that state's electors, and then those states' electors cast votes for the actual president. Okay? So that leads us into our second response question and last response question for the night. Why do you think some people argue that the Electoral College is undemocratic? All right? Why do you think some people argue that the Electoral College is undemocratic? I want you to answer that question. Make sure you have your notes printed off and ready to go when you show up to class tomorrow.